that's what gives rise to the ethical imperative to not just say, I don't kill people, I don't steal, I don't cheat, I don't maim, but I'm also doing my part to make the world a better place, to reduce suffering, to reduce the injustice that comes from the fact that some people are fortunate enough to be born in countries like the United States, and other people are unfortunate enough to be born in circumstances where it's extremely hard for them to just meet their basic needs and to have a decent life.
Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. 10 years ago, Professor Peter Singer published the book, The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty. In this book, Singer argues that people in affluent countries have an ethical obligation to at least make an effort to save some of the poorest people in the world, people who are dying from totally preventable causes each day, many of them under 5 years old. Today, Professor Singer talks with me about the 10th anniversary edition of The Life You Can Save, which is an upgrade that reflects the most relevant and current data. The interview itself is a short one, but we do manage to reach a number of topics, including moral philosophy, giving to charity, practical and psychological obstacles to giving, and ways to assess various charitable organizations. Links to all of the things we talk about are in the show notes, including free downloads of both the ebook and audiobook versions of The Life You Can Save 10th Anniversary Edition. So enjoy now episode number 48 with the brilliant Professor Peter Singer. And before we take you to the episode, we want to remind you that we are funded solely on donations from listeners and viewers. If you'd like to contribute to the show, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. That's patreon.com/thesocialexchange. As always, thanks so much to our patrons, James Stacks, Chris L., Leon Naufahu, Sherry Chandler, Dee Stout, Christopher Hanlon, Andre Pompel, Carter Vermont, which is a nonprofit here in Vermont led by Dr. Rick Barnett, Ann M. Earl, Inigo, John Holt, Lila Ferguson, Mary K. Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina, Timmy Tucker, Christian, Tom Rhodes, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Diane T., Trevor, Susan Matthew, and Linda Rhodes. Again, if you would like to become a patron, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. And okay, now enjoy episode number 48 with Professor Peter Singer. I'm here with Professor Peter Singer. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, sir.
And congratulations on publishing the 10th anniversary edition of your book, The Life You Can Save. Reading this book really has shaped the way that I think about my own privilege in this world. And I mean it when I say it has inspired an upgrade to my personal and my family values, and that I've adopted a greater level of responsibility toward contributing to the well-being of people in this world, even if I've never met them and even if I never will. So I hope that in the short time we have here, we'll be able to create something of a similar impact on listeners. First and foremost, for the handful of people who may not be aware of you, could you quickly tell people who you are and your background and basis for writing The Life You Can Save?
Sure. Well, my name is Peter Singer. My background is in philosophy. I've been in philosophy essentially all of my working life. I currently hold two different positions, one at Princeton University, where I'm Professor of Bioethics in the University Centre for Human Values, and one at the University of Melbourne, where my title is Laureate Professor in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. I'm perhaps still best known for my 1970s book, Animal Liberation, which some people credit with kicking off the modern animal movement. But more recently, I guess I've become known for the book that you mentioned, The Life You Can Save, which first appeared 10 years ago and which is out now in a revised 10th anniversary edition, and that talks about global poverty and what we, that is, people who are reasonably comfortably off in affluent countries, should be doing about it.
One thing I think the book illustrates very well is just how many people are living in extreme poverty worldwide, and just how many people are dying from what seem to be easily preventable circumstances. Would you talk a little about this? And also, are these numbers better or worse than when you published the book in 2009?
Right. Well, start off with the second question, things are improving. The numbers are markedly better than they were in the first edition. So, for the number of people living in extreme poverty by the World Bank's definition, in the first edition, the figure I gave was 1.4 billion. That was the most up-to-date figure when the book went to press. In the current edition, it's 736 million. So almost halved, getting close to being halved. And that's paralleled by the number of children under 5 dying, according to UNICEF's, that's the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. According to their figures, there were 9.7 million children dying before reaching their 5th birthday when the first edition went to press. And just 10 years later, it's down to 5.4 million. So again, getting close to halving that figure, which is really good, but of course that's still a lot of children dying, and I should emphasize that most of these deaths are preventable. They're not like that all of these children get some form of cancer that we don't know to cure. That's a small fraction of it. Most of it are things like children dying from malaria, which we can prevent in various ways by distributing bed nets, by giving drugs, or they're dying from diarrhea, which we can prevent from improved sanitation, safe drinking water, and again we can cure with fairly simple, inexpensive methods. A whole lot of things like that. Children not getting enough to eat, being malnourished makes them weaker and more susceptible to diseases that otherwise wouldn't kill them. So there are lots of things we could do, and I think it's pretty shameful really when we look at the world and we see how much wealth and affluence there is in some parts of it, and yet we're not doing anything, or we're not doing enough to help people in extreme poverty elsewhere.
What do you think accounts for the improvement?
There are a number of factors. I think that effective aid programs have certainly made a difference. Immunization against diseases of various kinds have certainly saved a lot of lives, including measles, although we've got a bit of an epidemic of measles starting again because of some suspicion that people have of vaccination. But still, the number of children dying from measles is hugely down from what it used to be. And in addition to those aid programs, which do make some difference, there's no doubt that reducing poverty through expanding trade has also made a difference. When China became part of the global economy, the standard of living dramatically improved in China, and that's meant that there are hundreds of millions of people who used to be in extreme poverty in China who are not anymore. So that's definitely helped to improve the figures. It's a complex thing, but in many ways, despite all the doom and gloom that we feel, especially in the United States and Europe, but the world is getting a better place. It's getting there's less misery and suffering from extreme poverty than there used to be, and in that important sense, actually, it's a more just world as well. Although, of course, it's still very far from being a completely just world. But I think raising people at the bottom in the way we've been doing it is an important step forward.
Yeah, you sufficiently persuaded me a long time ago that at an individual level, it's extremely cheap and requires deceptively little effort for, let's say, a middle-class person like me to save the life of a person in a developing country. I don't know, are you able to offer a quasi-concrete dollar amount here? Like, how much does it take to save a life? Or maybe a better framing could be something like, what is the minimum amount of change that I would have to make in my day-to-day spending habits that would be required for me to save a person's life?
So it's not easy to tell exactly what that figure is. It will vary with different kinds of interventions that we have. And of course, in a way, you could be lucky. You could spend a very small amount on a bed net donated to the Against Malaria Foundation, and it could just happen that bed net saves a life.
Right.
It wouldn't have been otherwise. But statistically, you have to provide a lot of bed nets to save a life, because of course not every child is going to get malaria or die from malaria without a bed net. So the figures, as I say, will vary. I think figures I quote in the book tend to be in the high hundreds of dollars in some cases. I think providing radio advertisements to inform people about health conditions and where they can get help was shown to save lives at something like between $700 and $800 in a study in Burkina Faso, one of the poorer countries of Africa, and that's through giving to a charity called Development Media International. With the bed nets, again, the programs will vary. There might be $1,500, there might be $2,500 in different countries to save a life. So there's another way of preventing malaria that's shown to be somewhat cheaper in terms of giving people drugs at the season when malaria is most prevalent, preventative drugs that reduce the incidence of malaria. I think we're in the sort of $1,500 to $1,200 range, if I remember exactly. So it will vary. But if your listeners would like details, please go to thelifeyoucansave.org and look at the Where to Donate section, and you'll find all of the charities that I've mentioned are listed there, and you get a description of what they're doing.
Sure. Now, you make the argument that it's not only relatively easy and painless for someone like me, I'll use myself as an example moving forward, but to do more to save lives, but that if I really sat down and thought about it, if I hadn't before, it would actually be antithetical, perhaps to my own values, not to do more. You've helped a lot of people visualize this point through an intuition pump that you've called the shallow pond. Could you go through that thought experiment quickly?
Sure. So the shallow pond asks you to imagine that you have the opportunity to save the life of a child who is in danger of drowning in a shallow pond. But to do so, you have to ruin some expensive shoes that you're wearing, which will cost you some hundreds of dollars to replace. And, most people, when you describe their situation, would say, well, you shouldn't even be thinking about your shoes. We're talking about a child's life here. How can you compare the two? That's just wrong to even think about not saving the child in order to avoid ruining your shoes. But then, if that's what you think in this situation, why is it really so different when we're talking about a situation where the child is not in front of you in a pond, but is in another country, is at risk of dying from malaria or diarrhea or measles, one of these things that I've mentioned, and we don't know exactly which child we'll save, but we know that if we give the sorts of figures I've been mentioning, then we are very likely, even certain, if we give higher figures, to save a child's life. So that ought to be just as serious an ethical wrong, that is, not doing what you need to do to save a child's life, ought to be just as serious an ethical wrong whether the child is in front of you or far away. And that's why something seems askew in the way we think about the ethics of saving lives.
If I were a listener of this show, and so far maybe you've convinced me that I could and should do more to save lives by donating to well-studied charities that we'll talk about, or actually that I'll link to in the show notes, it might leave me with questions. One that you just brought up: why is it so difficult, do you suspect, for human beings in general to do the ethical calculus that you expressed? Why does it seem so intuitive to save a child in a shallow pond, but so abstract that I could have the same effect by donating to a charity in a developing country?
To answer that question, I think we need to think about the circumstances in which our ancestors over many, many generations lived and evolved the moral responses that we have today. So they lived in small face-to-face communities. Most anthropologists think that our ancestors lived in groups of maybe between 1 and 200. So you knew everybody, you got to know everybody in that society, and you developed a response to help the people that you knew, and that clearly was not only good for the social group, but it was also good for you. You developed a reputation as a contributor, someone who put in, and other people would be more likely to form partnerships with you and reciprocate with you, which is better for you. So I think that's why we have this response to the child in the pond. Here's the child in front of you who you can see and identify. But for all of those aeons of generations, we were not able to help people far away from us. We didn't know anything about them. We couldn't help them, and it wouldn't have been useful for us. It wouldn't have helped us to survive and reproduce if we had known about them, because in some sense they were our rivals. So that's why I think we don't have this sense of yes, I ought to help a stranger. We can understand it intellectually. If we think about it rationally, we can see the point that yes, the well-being of a person doesn't vary by how far they are from me. But in terms of an emotional response that might propel us into action, it feels very different.
To elevate that just a little bit, so I live in Vermont, so why is it, do you suppose, that I'm more inclined intuitively to donate to somebody I don't know in California who has been affected by wildfires, let's say, than to donate to a person that I don't know in South Sudan who can't afford a bed net?
I think that's a matter of people who, in some sense, you can identify with. You can say, they're my fellow Americans. There's more that you share. So I think that's a kind of a halfway house between the person in front of you and the person in another country. You do feel some bond because this person is a member of the same country and a citizen, or perhaps just a resident. But anyway, there's something there that you grab onto and you latch onto, and you say, this could have been me. We're all in this enterprise together of trying to care for each other, and the national boundaries there make a sort of some kind of difference. As I say, it's not the same as someone in front of you, or particularly not somebody who's a member of your family or close friends, but it's still different from somebody who's in another country.
What is your response to folks who say, yeah, I could give, but how can you say I have an ethical obligation to? One of the things that makes the U.S. home to so many people with so much to give perhaps is the fact that we're free to make as much money as we want and to spend it how we please.
Well, we're free to do that, and I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be free to do that, but I'm arguing that we should think about something more than what pleases us, or perhaps to put it slightly differently, we should think about what will please us, not just in the material sense of saying, now I can surround myself with more consumer goods, I can get the latest phone, I can have a bigger TV, I can take a more expensive holiday, but we should think about what will please us in the sense of leaving us fulfilled and satisfied and convinced that we're leading a meaningful life. And I think there's good psychological research to show that actually is more important for our long-term well-being and happiness than the consumer goods. So one thing I would say, in line with answering your question, is let's think about what will please us in a broader sense. But of course, you did also ask about our ethical obligations, and I do think that if we want to regard ourselves as living an ethical life, then we can't ignore the situation of people in extreme poverty elsewhere in the world, and we can't ignore the fact that we have the ability to make a big difference to the lives of specific individuals at a very small cost to ourselves that won't make any significant difference to ourselves in our life. So I think that's what gives rise to the ethical imperative, to not just say, I don't kill people, I don't steal, I don't cheat, I don't maim, but I'm also doing my part to make the world a better place, to reduce suffering, to reduce the injustice that comes from the fact that some people are fortunate enough to be born in countries like the United States, and other people are unfortunate enough to be born in circumstances where it's extremely hard for them to just meet their basic needs and to have a decent life.
Listeners might be surprised at how difficult it is to ask all the kinds of questions I want to in only 20 minutes. It's a good exercise, but we'll wind it down. Lastly, you have a list of effective charities that I will have linked to in the show notes. Are there any specific charities that you'd recommend above all? And how can people be sure, and indeed how are you sure, that these charities are effective? And how are you distinguishing those between ones that you wouldn't deem as effective?
There are about 20 lists that the Life You Can Save recommends, which you're going to link to, I know.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been selected by a panel that looks at the research that has been done to demonstrate that these charities are highly effective. And this is research not done by the charities themselves, but done by outside evaluators, organizations that are looking at the impact, like GiveWell and Impact Matters. So it is independent research that we're looking at to try to evaluate, try to find the very best organizations that are having the most impact, giving you the best value per dollar that you donate in terms of helping people in extreme poverty. So please do, I hope your listeners will look at the links, look at the website, and also, of course, we talked at the beginning about the 10th anniversary edition of The Life You Can Save. That's now available absolutely free on the website as an ebook or as an audiobook. And the audiobook has chapters read by different celebrities, people like the actress Kristen Bell, the singer-songwriter Paul Simon, the English actor, comedian Stephen Fry, Indian actress Shabana Azmi, African Winnie Almer, a whole lot of different people from around the world have contributed to this project. So I hope people will get the book and also look at the website and look at the information on that.
Great. And besides linking to the free book, which I'll also do in the show notes, are there any other ways for people to learn more about you and your work, and or any other projects you'd like me to direct my listeners' attention toward?
So we've been talking a lot about extreme poverty, which is obviously related to the book that's come out. As I said in introducing myself, I have had a role right at the start of the modern animal advocacy movement. I am concerned, as well as being concerned about the suffering of people in extreme poverty, I am concerned about the suffering of literally tens of billions of animals in factory farms right now in conditions that are not at all geared to the well-being of the animals, but only geared to producing their meat, milk, or eggs as cheaply as possible. So you can also be effective in trying to reduce that suffering, and the parallel to The Life You Can Save in that area is a website called Animal Charity Evaluators. So if people are interested in doing something about that, please have a look at that site as well.
Thank you so much. And by the way, we've had Paul Shapiro on the show before, who did nothing but sing your praises. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's great. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to talk to your listeners. Sorry, my time is short, but yes. I think I've got a lot of the essentials out there, so that's really great.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for being very charitable, not only with your money or your hard work and education, advocacy, also donating some of your time to be on the show today. Much appreciated.